this is a kind of a deal which is something that Trump can hype, but when it comes down to it, this is not the deal. This is not something that really he can feel, that's it, honor is satisfied, I have sorted things out in Ukraine. And if he is seriously thinking about wanting to get a Nobel Peace Prize, which does appear to be part of the calculation, this is not going to cut it.
Mark Galeotti, thank you so much for speaking to us. We've had this parade of European leaders heading to the White House to try to win over Donald Trump, Macron, and then Starmer and Zelensky heading over there. What do you think the Kremlin will be making of these very public shows of an alliance?
Well, look, I think it's fair to say that the Kremlin is still treating Trump with some caution. They are absolutely delighted that there is now contact between Russia and the United States. We've already had, for example, this week, closed-door conversations in Istanbul between experts to actually turn the kind of grand declaratory statements into real action on the ground. They're obviously very pleased not only by the fact that Trump says such nice things about Putin, but that he is causing such discord and dismay within the Western alliance. But for all that, there is still quite a distinct note of caution in Russian official pronouncements, especially when it comes to Ukraine. Putin himself has more or less been saying, look, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's not assume that suddenly everything is going to be wonderful. So they appreciate that with Trump, what you see today may not be what you get tomorrow. So yes, they're very happy, but there is still that cautious sense that they'll believe that things will work out their way when it actually happens.
And so far this week, President Macron led the charge in terms of trying to persuade Donald Trump to give a security guarantee for Europe. So Keir Starmer went, having upped defence spending in the UK, did the same thing, didn't really get any answers on that in last night's press conference. Volodymyr Zelensky clearly wants US security guarantees. Trump has refused to give any specifics about that. How do you think the Kremlin will be taking that seeming lack of European leaders getting what they want?
The current feedback we're actually getting from Russian official sources, I mean, obviously they are happy about that. Although, again, so there's always this problem. We are very aware of our vulnerabilities. The Russians are very aware of their own. I mean, there is still that sense that actually, if there was a European presence, would the Americans totally abandon them in that particular crunch moment? Probably not, which is precisely why Putin doesn't want European troops to be in Ukraine. So in other words, to kind of forestall that whole issue. I mean, again, there is satisfaction, though, that these various Western leaders are not getting what they want. And particularly their satisfaction that although this minerals deal that Ukraine is signing with the United States is actually a pretty wishy-washy document, it doesn't really commit anyone to much. But nonetheless, there is satisfaction at the fact that Zelensky was traveling to Washington to sign it, and then actually Washington tried to cancel that by all accounts, and it seems to have been that Zelensky had to intercede, ask Macron to talk to Trump to get the invitation reinitialized. That does not, after all, look like the actions of an American administration that is at all interested, frankly, in talking to the Ukrainians. And that is definitely, I think, the particular point that the Russians are finding quite satisfying.
Let's dig into the peacekeepers point, because I think it was on Monday when speaking to Macron, Donald Trump said, Vladimir Putin has no problem with the idea of European peacekeepers. The Kremlin pretty quickly on the Tuesday morning came out and said, no, that is still unacceptable. Then went on later in the week to call it empty talk. But one way or the other, the Kremlin is still very much signalling European peacekeepers is absolutely not something we could accept. Do you think there is a landing zone where a European peacekeeping force actually happens?
I mean, it's possible. Again, this is the thing. You go into negotiations often having your sense of your red lines, and then you end up having to, take the eraser out and move them and shift them actually once the talks start. Because the same way as from the Russians' point of view, European peacekeepers are unacceptable, I think it's fairly clear that from the Ukrainian point of view, UN peacekeepers or the like would also be unacceptable. They feel they need to have security guarantees with teeth, and frankly, that's entirely understandable. So, it's one of these areas where it's always hard to gauge. the Russian style of negotiation tends to be very hardball. Very much, even when they're actually thinking of potential concessions, until the absolute 11th hour and 59th minute, they'll be saying how totally unacceptable it is, precisely because they want to extract the best possible reciprocal concessions for that. So, it's hard to be sure, but it may well come down to a very stark choice for Putin. That if he wants to end this war in a way that already looks fairly satisfactory for him, being in control of almost a fifth of Ukraine, and if he wants to end it before 2026, when probably a lot of the sort of long forestalled problems will really start to come home for Russia, then it may be that he'll have to accept that. But certainly at the moment, that's not their preferred option. They would rather, frankly, Ukraine, which is continually vulnerable. And therefore, if they can keep European troops out, or else at least keep the troops that are there not to be from the main military countries of Europe, they may well be perfectly comfortable seeing, and my apologies to these countries that I'm going to mention, but say Greek, Danish, and Slovak peacekeepers there, so long as they don't have to think about there being British and French and maybe German and Polish forces, then there may be some kind of room. So this is a very long way of saying we don't really know. But I think that there's still quite a few different sort of options around this whole possibility.
Donald Trump has long wants to tout himself as the great deal maker. The minerals deal with Ukraine is the latest in his string of deals. How much is that a problem for the Kremlin? Do you think that's going to change the dial in terms of Trump's relationship with Ukraine and therefore the Russian reaction in terms of he has now got this mano a mano deal with Volodymyr Zelensky?
In such an important deal for Trump, then one would imagine that he would have actually wanted Zelensky to be there in the White House to sign it. And given that he seems to have not been particularly keen on that, it suggests that he's aware that what he's got is a bit of a mutilated deal. It's enough for him to go back to his base and say, Sleepy Joe Biden gave away all this money. I'm the one who's actually going to make sure it gets repaid. So both you have a secure Ukraine and America getting repaid, in fact, repaid plus in his own words. So, I think this is a useful deal. In some ways, he is framing it as a kind of alternative form of security guarantee, in that if all these various kind of rare earths and similar deposits are going to be exploited, and there's a huge debate actually about quite how great a value they have. At the moment, a lot of them are not being exploited because it's going to require technology, it's going to require investment, and thus presumably it's going to require American companies to be involved on the ground to actually do that. And so there is the idea that you may well not have peacekeepers, but if you have American interests there, that will be a deterrence for Putin. Maybe, maybe not. But on the other hand, from the Ukrainians' point of view, it really is nothing like the kind of security that they feel they need. So, I think this is a kind of a deal which is something that Trump can hype, but when it comes down to it, this is not the deal. This is not something that really he can feel, that's it, honor is satisfied, I have sorted things out in Ukraine. And if he is seriously thinking about wanting to get a Nobel Peace Prize, which does appear to be part of the calculation, this is not going to cut it.
And exactly as you say, the Americans say this is the security guarantee in itself. And analysts have looked at the deal and said, well, no American company in their right minds is going to invest all that time and money in mining Ukraine's mineral wealth unless Uncle Sam, they know either explicitly or implicitly, is going to back them if it all goes wrong. Does the Kremlin see it that way? Does Vladimir Putin see this as some form of US security guarantee, or is he seeing through this as essentially, as you're saying, a bit of a duff deal?
Well, let me put it this way. The Kremlin certainly does not seem bothered by this deal, which implies that they do see through it. And indeed, we actually have, in an interesting and sly little bit of sort of jujitsu, we now have Putin saying, look, we have even greater reserves of all these minerals, which are, it has to be said, massively underexploited so far, precisely because of the need for investment in technology. A lot of it is in very inhospitable conditions in the Arctic Circle and so forth. And we will be delighted to work with the Americans to see that. So in some ways, actually, what Putin is saying is, to put it very bluntly, whatever the Ukrainians are in effect offering you, I can meet it and more. So, I mean, I think once we start seeing the conversation move from issues of morality and security into issues of just simply economic opportunity, the bottom line is that Russia could offer rather more. Now, again, there's too many American companies, Western companies in general, which have been burned in Russia, forced to sort of withdraw because of the political environment. So I don't think anyone's going to be beating down that particular door. But it says something about Putin's capacity to identify what matters to Trump and essentially try and skew his arguments into ways that seem to appeal most sort of greatly to someone who really sees his job as being the chief executive officer of USA Incorporated rather than a statesman president.
Two more questions, Mark. This parade of European leaders, the glad handing with Donald Trump, and a sort of a show of the transatlantic alliance, do you think that will have bothered Vladimir Putin? Is that a step back?
I mean, obviously, they approach this with some concern, and particularly the initial Macron visit, because Macron is, in his own way, quite able to actually be charismatic and persuasive on a one-to-one level, and certainly has a decent track record of working with Donald Trump. Now, given that it was essentially unsuccessful, I mean, at least Sakir has left Washington, given that he had anyway two agendas, one of which was Ukraine and the other one was the wider trade issue, with not much on Ukraine, but the suggestion that the UK may well avoid the tariffs that Trump is planning on putting on the European Union, and there might be some kind of a trade deal in process. You know, sort of whereas sort of Sakir had two objectives and kind of achieved one, Macron ultimately got kind words and a glad handing, but actually nothing achieved. And that's very much something that the Russians are fully aware of. And so in some ways, I think they're breathing a sigh of relief because sure, Zelensky's going to be there and Zelensky can be very compelling. But on the other hand, there is so much bad blood there now. And other European leaders are in due course going to be going there. But I think from the Russians' point of view, if Macron couldn't actually start to move the dial in some measurable way, then three more European leaders are not going to make a difference. So I think they're quite comfortable with how things have gone.
This week, Sir Keir Starmer's increased UK defence spending, or will increase UK defence spending to 2.5% of GDP. The German Chancellor says he wants to increase Germany's defence budget. Is there a sense that actually, whether it's 3 years of this war or the last few weeks of Donald Trump, this is the opposite of what the Kremlin wants? Europe is rearming and trying to re-strengthen, whether or not the US is going to be as involved in Europe or not. Surely that is bad news for Vladimir Putin.
Quite catastrophic for Putin in the sort of the wider terms. I mean, his country is increasingly getting economically scarred by the cost of maintaining a war economy. It's increasingly dependent upon Beijing. Its labor market is absolutely sort of at full capacity. And yes, he sees Europe and indeed NATO generally becoming more and more sort of security focused than ever. On the other hand, look, let's be clear. I mean, 2 to 2.5, even to 3%. We're still talking about relatively small figures, which are going to take years to actually play out on the ground. Though for all this talk about moving to a war economy or whatever, no one in Europe is even tiptoeing close to that. I mean, the Poles and the Balts are the closest, really, but even they are not getting into that sort of status. So I think from the Kremlin's point of view, yes. But if you had to decide between a 2%, shall we say, NATO with full American backing, or a European NATO which is spending 3% on defense, but which no longer feels it can actually trust the Washington to back it up, frankly, I think the latter is still something that the Russians would find more appealing.
I promised that was the last one. Do you have time for one more question? Thank you, Mark. The UN. Russia and the US have voted together twice earlier on in the week on statements on Ukraine, the US voting against statements that would have beefed up essentially the criticism of Russia for starting the war. That split the US from Britain and France. How significant do you think that is? Is it significant at all? And how, again, will Russia be feeling about having the US voting alongside them for once?
In terms of the actual UN, I think it's pretty irrelevant. I mean, the interesting thing is that both Trump and Putin regard all these kind of international structures as being pretty much irrelevant. They are very much realpolitik, transactional national opportunists. Symbolically, though, it really was important because precisely, I mean, the sight of the United States not just being willing to abstain, I mean, that would have been shocking enough, but to actually side with the Russians in torpedoing what was a critical, but not in any way politically significant statement. I think Russia has got already so many critical statements leveled against it in fora like the UN that one more wouldn't make a difference. But again, I think from the Russians' point of view, it's a great signal. It's a great signal of two things. One, precisely that it's no longer isolated. But secondly, of the fact that essentially Trump's America is one that is precisely unwilling to be constrained by any of the old orthodoxies. All the old mantras, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes, Putin must be seen to lose. They were always pretty empty, but nonetheless, they represented a kind of a core set of views that we had a Western consensus around. That's all gone now, thanks to Donald Trump, and that definitely is good for Moscow.